Hey, everybody. Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well and avoiding the malevolence of microbes. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We are beaming to you from unceded Aramish Ohlone land, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the summer season and beyond, and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. So, City Lights has always been kind of at the nexus where literature, music, film, politics all meet. There's been a lot of cross-pollination between artists working in different fields as they kind of pass through the store. And indeed, the environment of North Beach and San Francisco has often contributed to that, from clubs like the Keystone Corner, the Jazz Workshop, to the punk mecca Mabuhay Gardens. Our orbit has always kind of crossed over into the realm of music. So it is natural for us to regularly feature artists we feel have successfully kind of walked in both worlds. Our guests this afternoon are both excellent living illustrations of that. We are delighted to have with us Marc Ribot, celebrating the launch of his new book, Unstrung, Rants and Stories of a Noise Guitarist. It is published by our friends over at Akashic Books in Brooklyn. Mr. Ribot is one of the most innovative and genre-defying musicians of our time. He has continued to generate over the span of his career some very wild sonic vistas, challenging our assumptions about what is possible with a guitar. So with Unstrung, he shares with us some really awesome stories and essays, really brimming with honesty, insight, humor. He reflects on music, friendship, the life of an artist, being on the road, and really reveals he is as adept at writing as he is at making music. Marc Ribot has published over 25 albums under his own name over a 40-year career, exploring a variety of musical themes. He has collaborated with just a veritable who's who of musicians that include people like Tom Waits, Robert Plant, Elvis Costello, Neko Case, Marianne Faithfull, Allen Ginsberg, and many, many others. He works regularly with the Grammy Award-winning producer T-Bone Burnett, also the New York composer John Zorn. He has also composed and performed on numerous film scores. These include Walk the Line, Kids Are All Right, and The Departed. I could actually say much, much more, but hey, buy the book. You're getting a full scope of really a remarkable life in music. So joining him in conversation today is none other than Elliot Sharp. He is no stranger to City Lights. We have hosted him before for that wonderful book he did, Irrational Music, from Terra Nova Press a while back. Elliot Sharp is a contemporary classical composer, multi-instrumentalist, and performer. He's a central figure in the avant-garde and experimental music scenes in New York City since the late 70s, and he's released over 85 recordings ranging from contemporary classical, avant-garde, free improvisation, jazz, experimental, no wave, and so on and so forth. So really, really honored to have both of them with us here today. And so now, please join us in giving a warm welcome to Marc Ribot and Elliot Sharp. Gentlemen, welcome to City Lights Live.
Pleasure to
Thank you.
Thank you.
Likewise. So, did we decide in our very careful planning session that I was going to start off by reading a selection? I think yes. So I will. Why not? This is a piece called "Oh Say Can You See." American life is lonely. I call you sometimes when I'm off the road. We have coffee near your stop on the N train. The trains are slower now. Most often I don't call. In our fantasies, we're the honeymooners or Seinfeld or the cast of Cheers or some other sitcom, always wandering into each other's private spaces unannounced. America mourns MASH, the headlines read. Psychotherapists on call for end of TV dynasty. Even Alan Alda cried a little. We found more time when the kids were little to go to the park or the bowling alley. Now we're busy. I'm writing 1 million emails while supposedly working on my solo album. What is it that you do when you're alone? In MASH, everyone knew what everyone did. Thin tent walls and public mess halls left every human foible exposed to Alan Alda's venomous sneer. It was funny. They were there to fight communists. Communists had the nerve to choose such living situations voluntarily. Communism equals war minus death, no dignity, no privacy. They were like a family to me, said the weeping woman in the Daily News. In Rome, the film score recording sessions began at 10 a.m. and ended promptly at 7. A huge Rube Goldberg device attached to the projector carried the celluloid film through whatever pathways the length of the looped scene demanded at precisely 24 frames a second. The studio was grand, paneled in some kind of blonde wood, big enough to accommodate an orchestra. Sometimes channels at the end of the board crackled with neglect, but it was no problem. There were other channels. Sometimes Benini stopped by to see how we were doing. At 1 p.m., we did as the Romans and broke 2 hours for a 3-course lunch, antipasto, primo, secondi, dolce, caffè. This was not what we were used to in the New York City bunkers, where indie musicians score indie films by the lamp of the midnight oil amid the detritus of takeout styrofoam and cold coffee. Indie means independent, I explained to the worldly Italian producer. Yes, I know, he responded, lighting a cigarette. I've worked in America before. It reminded me of being in the military, a huge army organized for production. It was a memorable meal, but that's all I remember. It happened a long time ago during the Italian miracle, before Berlusconi, before the euro, the crash of the euro, and the inevitable restructuring whose austerity will no doubt become what passes for fate. When you've driven to the edge of America, as far north as you can go, past Augusta, past Bangor, past Holton, past the fenced-off sack base at Limestone and the last all-night Dunkin' Donuts, up where the wind blows heavy on the borderline and the long winter's wear and tear has made your Kodachrome superfluous months ago, then you're at the end of America, the border, the limit. But for Canadians, it's just the beginning. And here's what every Canadian, in fact, everyone in the world who's not American knows about America. It is the land of sex. And that's why you're here in a hotel bar in Van Buren, Maine in 1976, standing in a matching wide-collared outfit with the rest of your band, scratching out the chords to The Hustle on a cherry red 1967 Melody Maker, while off to the side on a stage consisting of a dirty rug and plywood thrown over packing crates. The exotic dancer contorts and grovels listlessly, while 5 or 6 drunk potato farmers aim Canadian nickels at her pussy. They mostly miss, but she's far too medicated. Her dance always threatening to devolve into crawling, twitching, or sleep. Somehow, implausibly, it's afternoon, and what gray winter light manages to pass the filthy windows enters an uneasy alliance with the red of the single stage light's cracked gel, an unhealthy blend not flattering to the human form. Every now and then, a gust of cold wind and bright light from the exit door strips the last exotic defense from the naked dancer's now only too familiar flesh. In front of you, your lead singer, Kay, goes slightly cross-eyed, trying to puff out a breathy melody on her flute in time to mouth the song's only lyric, "Do the hustle." A year later, Kay would get all banged up trying to make a gig in Fort Kent, last stop on Route 1, which begins in Key West, during a blizzard. But today, she and her leaky flute are in fine form. Maybe Kay's equally sturdy French-Canadian girlfriend, Donna, had come with the band on this run and was sitting in the back, drinking heavily and scowling at the potato men. Donna's ancestors had drifted across the border with the lumber trade. There was a derogatory name the Maine Yankees used for these other Acadians, but you've happily forgotten it. Maybe Donna hadn't come after all. Strippers who couldn't make it in New York City went to Boston. Those who couldn't make it in Boston went to Portland. Those who couldn't make it in Portland went to Bangor. Beyond that was the exotic dancer circuit, a stripper's equivalent of the glue factory. A similar map could be drawn for professional musicians.
And Mark, that is the 70s, indeed, encapsulated. Do you remember our friend Steve Piccolo's solo album, Domestic Exile? I think this is a term that we both have, a term that we both have taken to heart at times. I mean, you, as many New York musicians do, make most of our living on the road, especially in Europe and Asia, and then we return home. I mean, how does that seem to you as a balance of life and art, and how much of that is encapsulated in this writing?
Well,
it's kind of a loaded question, but
it's a good question. First of all, I'm doing my very best about the return home part. I'm kind of living between I'm living between New York and Italy right now, and well, let's see how things go. But I'm returning home a bit less frequently, but I think that that going back and forth has had an influence in a number of ways. First of all, I've lived for the last 40 years in a constant state of jet lag, and I owe probably the fact of having written most of what I've written to that fact alone. The fact, what that means quite literally is that I'm sleeping when other people are awake, and I'm awake when other people are sleeping. And, you know, my neighbors are very sensitive to sound, so you got to do something. So what I did was wrote most of these stories in those conditions. But I mean, the story I read about, you know, about playing top 40 stuff or playing in lounge bands, that's a worldwide phenomenon, and it coexists next to and around the kind of Euro jazz networks that I've toured in Europe, it coexists with some of the other work that I've done, you know, with touring with name artists. It's always there, and I'm kind of glad actually that I got that I did a lot of it before I entered the kind of musics that I'm doing now. I think that experience in a lot of ways informs what I did later.
certainly prepared you for playing with Tom Waits, I would say.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, but it's also a sense of reality. There's musicians who have always been groomed to exist in just the classical world or as jazz stars from the moment they first stepped on a stage. And while their work may be excellent, there is something about the gritty reality that can be missing, and that I think adds a lot of depth to it.
Well, I think you're right, and I think it's a kind of a bit of a generational change, like that. You and I come from a generation. Well, I mean, I think you actually. I went for 2 years to the universe. Well, not really 2 years. It was 1.5 years. Something happened, but anyways, to the University of Maine at Augusta. That's the extent of my formal music education, and it was well, I don't want to say anything bad about the program, but I learned most of what I know outside of it. Let's just say that most young musicians coming up today come through the conservatory or university system. And I learned most of what I knew. I came up through playing gigs and any kind of gig. And so it was, yeah, that was an interest. Yeah, I think I benefited from that, actually.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, and even in university, and I was in and out of universities a lot, as much out as in. And even when in, the real learning happened not in campus. Campuses were good for access to other people, to access to equipment, access to situations. But the learning, even studying with Roswell, who we both studied with,
Yeah.
the real education did not happen in classes. But Roswell Rudd, I'm speaking of, for those who want to know, a brilliant musician and musicologist and thinker, not necessarily a pedagogue, but in his own way, a brilliant teacher. And this happened at the bar down the road, long after everyone else was sleeping or in the library, you know. But hanging out at the bar, that's when you found out about how to be a musician and what it actually entailed.
Exactly. Well, you were playing in like blues bands and things, or you were playing in a lot of different kind of bands. And
Everything.
yeah.
Whoever would hire me, yeah.
Were you in some blues band with were you in some blues band with Lurie? Do I remember that correctly? Or
well, John Lurie and Evan Lurie and Steve Piccolo and I shared a house in upstate New York in Germantown. And Steve and I had a band, and John would guest with us, and Evan would guest with us. And this was 1974.
And John was playing harmonica, right?
That was before he got to upstate. He was playing alto saxophone.
Oh, okay.
More or less. And being a front man, though, always. The house was filled with merriment, shall we say.
I can imagine, yeah.
Yes.
No, I just wanted to acknowledge for the audience how weird it is for us to be talking on Zoom instead of either jamming or drinking heavily or both. Elliot and I are neighbors in New York. Anyways, sorry to interrupt.
We've known each other for 40 years.
Exactly, yes, right. So
bands, situations, having many meals and such. I remember, in fact, I was going to bring up, I remember one time we were all eating breakfast. There was a cafe in East Village where you could often find most of the downtown New York music scene eating breakfast, the Mogador Cafe. And I remember one time you announced to me you were writing poetry. You had decided to write, I don't know if you were writing poetry, but you had said you had decided to write poetry.
Really?
And
that must have been a really rough day. I
yes,
mean, everybody writes poetry, but most of us have the decency not to show it in public. You know, it's a rule that I have certainly kept to myself. Oh, Elliot,
well, you know, it made me think. Oh, so
you're breaking up there, Elliot. Am I going to have to invent my own interview questions? We were complaining before about how New York has great bands but terrible bandwidth.
Yeah. Hey, Elliot, you know, why don't you try deactivating your video and just see if you can go audio? I mean, that might actually help a bit.
yes, let's do that.
Try
okay.
now.
Okay. Well, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Now we hear you.
Sound coherent?
Great.
Good. Anyway, Mark, I was going to say what that reminded me of, and so much of your book brings me back to it first brought me back to the famous Adorno quote, which is actually not a quote at all, saying after the Holocaust, how can anyone make art? And then I did some research on the quote, and the actual quote is, after Auschwitz, to write poetry is barbarism. And that made me think of our breakfast.
Yeah, but you know, like he says that like there's something wrong with barbarism.
Indeed. So now, I mean, your work has a brutality about it, and it's often indicated in titles but it's not like a brutality like I'm going to come kill you. It's a brutality recognizing, well, you might be addressing other people, but it's a brutality that comes from looking at the world from a sense of having lived in it, as opposed to being ensconced in the ivory tower.
Yeah, yeah, I would say, I mean, I once actually had a band called the Brutal Atavisms,
Yes, flick
which
gigs
had a,
together.
yeah, that's right, that's right. I think at Roulette, it featured a Zerna player whose name I forget. But I mean, I'm not, you know, I don't know. Maybe we've both been accused of that. I remember the first time I saw Carbon in some place. I think it was on tiny place. I think it was on Houston Street, and I was super impressed. I couldn't figure out how you were doing all these complicated left hand and right hand hammering that was, you know, like I was there with my, you know, mouth hanging open. How does the guy do that? But the you know, brutal might be applied to some of the Carbon things. Some
Yeah,
of my favorite Carbon compositions.
well, you know, I think when we were operating in the kind of punk and post-punk world, you had to wear your brutality on your sleeve, even if you were really sensitive inside, a poet. You know, that was part of the stance because you had to confront things that maybe were not being confronted in the media. I mean, also, the thing is, we were all very marginalized, at least in terms of doing our own music in the 80s, I
Yeah,
would
I
say.
mean, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess, look, I mean, if we talk about brutal, I guess that, I mean, that makes sense in a rock. I mean, well, I remember reading this book by Jacques Attali called Noise. And Attali's theory was that concert music descended from human sacrifice. And human sacrifice has a kind of a bad name nowadays, but according to Attali, way back when, it was actually, it was this kind of ritualized, organized violence was actually an improvement on the random out of control violence that preceded it. And so eventually they had bands play along with the human sacrifice, and eventually they stopped sacrificing the people and just had the bands. But the thing was that the bands had to do the work of channeling this social violence. So, and if they didn't do it, there was a danger that the real thing would break out, which is why every new generation of music has been perceived as violent or brutal in some way. You know, I mean, if you read the press around 1920s jazz, you know, people were saying this is the end of the world. This is violent, brutal. It's people are going to kill each other and have sex in the streets. It's the end of society. If you read the descriptions of Elvis Presley, it said the same thing. And it all, you know, I mean, so, you know, and of course, needless to say, you know, we get the same tag. Maybe in the future, our Carbon will sound like, you know, like early Elvis Presley. But, you know, we're all just doing our job of trying to, you know, of channeling what's there, trying to prevent real social breakdown.
But do you think part of that is trying to do something new? That part of the channeling of the sacrifice is to not do what has already been done? I mean,
Yeah,
there's a comfort. Of course, there's a comfort, and you're more likely to make a living if you're on stage playing the favorite songs of the audience. You know, I mean, I've done gigs, I'm sure you have, where they gave the band a song list before you play. Say, this is what you have to play if you want to get paid, and you start playing original music. Even I remember playing a gig once where the host was saying, "Well, people aren't dancing to you because even though your beat is good, they don't recognize the songs." You know, so that the actual content of the music was superseded by its framing.
yeah. There's always the problem of people telling you what to do. Um, but yes, I do think that I think there's a reason for new music, and there's a reason for why. I mean, if whether Itali's right or wrong, I have no idea. It's a nice theory, you know. But I think that there's a reason why people have yesterday's means of channeling whatever it is that needs to be channeled won't work next year, and et cetera, et cetera. But there's a question of how you get there. And I've never been very ambitious about actually trying to do something new. I'm just kind of trying to rock musically anyways. I'm just kind of trying to rock the house, and I hope that I hope people like it. You know, I think that there's, you know, the me who's trying to rock the house is somebody who's bored by most of what's come before. So, you know, that kind of propels a certain attempt to do something new. But, and I definitely respect those who have taken on the challenge of consciously trying to make formal innovations. But like I say, I'm just trying to rock the house, you know.
Well, now, how about in writing? Are you trying to, how do you see your own writing in the pantheon of literature? I mean, who inspired you? Would you say there are literary models for your writing, or are you just writing what you feel? Do you think about where it fits, or how it might be contextualized, or how it might be seen in comparison to other types of musical autobiographies?
Yeah, well, I mean, Lynn Tillman, who wrote the introduction to the book, is a favorite writer of mine. I used to read a lot of the people who were published in, there was a literary, sort of a literary magazine in the 80s called Between C and D, that was a lot of Lower East Side based writers, Lynn included. Anyways, it was printed out on computer sprocket paper, delivered in a plastic bag. So, you know.
It's funny because I ran into Michael last Saturday, who I hadn't seen in quite a few years, Michael Carter, who published it.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, those are the writers that some of the writers I was reading, and I suppose influenced by. As far as addressing literary history by writing my book, I was more addressing my own insomnia.
Do you think about another book? Writing one.
I mean, I've been writing stories since I was a kid, so it's something I do. I mean, the way this one came about was I had kind of not really thought very hard about publishing. Once I tried to get a publishing deal, and I think my manager met somebody who was a publisher, and so I sent them a bunch of stuff, I set up a meeting with them and sent them a bunch of stuff, and they said, well, Mark, this stuff is all very nice, but what we had in mind was like more stuff about like what it was like to work with Tom Waits and Elvis Costello and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, okay, well, nice meeting you. And I kind of walked out. Not mind you, that Tom and Elvis and you know, and the people I've worked with haven't been very interesting people, but they're quite good at telling their own stories. It's not really mine to tell. So anyways, after that, I just kind of, you know, said, well, I kept writing. every now and then I show one to a friend to make them laugh, you know. And Kurt Hollander read a bunch of this, a couple of them, who was one of the editors of Between C and D, actually, I think. And he showed them without asking me to the people at Akashic, and they liked them. And that's how this happened. It only occurred to me as an afterthought. I thought, well, that would be nice to hold a physical object of a book, you know, have them all incorporated in that. It only occurred to me as an afterthought, oh my God, other people are going to read these. So there it is.
Did you get elbow patches for your jacket once you were published?
Not yet. I should.
One thing I noticed reading the book, which of course I enjoyed greatly, but I enjoyed it in different ways at different times. And I noticed that you write in a few different voices. There are different versions of the first person. Is that a conscious device, or is it just how the stories came out?
Well, I'm a notoriously unreliable narrator. And it wasn't really a conscious choice. It was kind of how they came out. My partner has informed me that when I speak Italian, I speak in a completely different, I speak Italian very poorly, but when I do, I speak in a very different voice than I speak English. And I realized I was like modeling my Italian on The Godfather. So it just kind of came out that way, yeah.
Did you ever feel?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that some of the stories were ever breaking a confidence, or you felt that these are, you know, I was especially moved by the story about Franz Casus, and you had told me about him on a number of times. So, and reading them it was very poignant, you know, and I maybe it would be something you might want to read later, an excerpt later in this episode, or even speak about that relationship a bit and how you put it into words, because I think you captured so much of his own, what's the word that I want to use, because it sounded like he enjoyed most of his life. He wasn't a miserable, you know, like Bela Bartok, starving in an apartment. He had a good life here, but it wasn't what it should have been.
Right. Well, Franz was a friend of my family's. Well, first of all, Franz Casellas is still known as the father of Haitian classical guitar. And Franz, he emigrated to the United States, as I wrote about in the story. He emigrated to the United States in order to be able to, but not in order to get away from Haitian music, in order to realize his dream of composing a Haitian classical guitar music and introducing it to the world stage, as he put it. And somewhere along so, you know, also, as I mentioned in what I wrote, Franz had decided to become a classical guitarist. He dropped out of law school in Port-au-Prince in order to become a classical guitarist, which didn't really endear him to his family, who had other hopes for him. So he felt the need to get out of Haiti to write some of what he needed to write, although he went back and revisited many times, and kept up close connection. So he was living in sort of quasi-self-imposed exile in New York, and he became close friends with my family. My aunt, the late Rhoda Unger, was a songwriter and had a lot of musician friends, and anyways, they got introduced, and he used to, they kind of shared a car. He'd hang out at my aunt and uncle's house. They wound up helping him get an apartment. It was one of those weird New York extended families that just kind of happened. They had some kind of cooperative arrangement with a car. Anyways, so the upshot of it is that when I was like 6, Franz would be at like Thanksgiving dinner, Passover dinner or something. And he would be, he must have been bored really, because he would bring his guitar and he'd play. And that's the first real live music I heard. So yeah, without retelling the whole story, I wound up taking lessons with Franz not because I wanted to play rock and roll, but I guess Franz needed students, and my family decided, okay, the kid wants to play guitar, he's 11, he'll study with Franz. And that wound up being a very indirect way to play what I wanted to play, but actually, as is often the case, indirect is positive, So yeah, maybe I'll read some of that later.
That actually brings me to a thought about the path less well taken, adding difficulty, adding obstacles. And also, I'm not sure how much time we have, so I'm trying to cram a lot into this one question. But an overriding theme, this poignancy of the sense of loss and of things being broken, whether things being broken in society, things being broken in the way things are going in your life at any given point that you're writing about, or how you view the things that are happening and how you put that into words. That seems to be a very large factor. Yeah, I could probably sum it up in the notion of the songs that people remember best are the sad songs. One of those cliches that we...
Sad songs say so much. I mean, let's face it, Inferno is the good part. Paradiso is really boring, Beatrice and all that stuff. Who cares, Come on. But thanks, good observation. I mean, I don't want to bum people out, it just happens.
Well, there's this definition that comedy is tragedy happening to someone else. So.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what Charlie Chaplin was the master of that. Buster Keaton.
Yep. I mean, I think we're living through some particularly strange moments of dislocation. I mean, the wisdom of our generation seems to be everything solid melts into air. And in the original context, that was a quote from a book describing the dislocation and horror of the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't meant to define everything for all time, but it also kind of seems to be what we're experiencing at the moment.
Well, every new technology disrupts the comfortable routine that people can accommodate.
Well,
deal with what they have to deal with, and then they're thrown a loop by being given a phone that allows them to do everything, and then accomplish nothing, or some other innovation that empties your pocket while destroying your attention.
Yeah, new technologies do disrupt, and new technologies do displace, but I think let let's put it this way, some of what we're experiencing is related to actual new technology, and some of it, what we're experiencing, what musicians have been experiencing in particular, but also Uber drivers, is the use of new technology to facilitate business models that enable very old-fashioned exploitation. So it's important to note that technology doesn't do anything by itself. It is used by the powers that be, and that's something that I've been involved in a group called Music Workers Alliance that deals with those issues. So if you're an indie musician or a DJ, musicworkersalliance.org, check it out. But don't get me started on this stuff, Elliot. You know this will kill the rest of the time.
Indeed. Well, you know, one thing I should say is that musicians should be commended for not contributing to inflation by being paid essentially the same as we have been for the last 50 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact,
exactly.
worse. I mean, we're really making a positive contribution.
Yeah.
There's a question. I'm glancing over at the chat, and someone is asking about responsibility to hear the rhythms in world music to more fully understand the music's natural meaning. Do you think the listener should be seeking meaning? I mean, this is a larger question, of course, of what we hear in any music, even music from our own culture. But having worked with people like Sister Bach, I want to speak about, you write about it in the book.
Yeah, well, I think that's relating to a particular one of the pieces in the book, which, let me see if I can remember. Well, if some clever person can put it in the chat. Oh yeah, world music, time and money. I mean, I hope when people listen to, I hope when people listen to the music of other cultures, other places from where they've grown up or from what's familiar, I hope they just listen and have a good time like I do, okay? But when you're playing, you know, when you get hired to play music again and again, you start to think about, well, how are people hearing this? What's it being used for? And I think that there are, you know, I've started to question what kind of myths people were buying. Friends of mine, for example, who are in, you know, what kind of myths of authenticity people were buying. Friends of mine from Colombia who were doing a really great roots Colombia band couldn't get a deal because they were living in New York, you know, like, and wearing jeans, and they felt that if they'd been, you know, if the same A&R people had gone to the end of the road in some mountainous region of Colombia and heard the same music, they would have been all over it. Cumbiamba was the name of the great band in New York, by the way. So let me look at the question again. I'm terrible at reading chats while I'm talking and listening.
Can I add, while you're looking, it seems that you can often discern a lot of the emotion that went into the music and a lot of the meaning, even without understanding the lyrics. There's so much packed into the way people play music that is communicated. But as you say, yes, if you're going to play it, you'd better understand why they made that music. You see a lot of, you know, party bands that play quote unquote world music, which I usually despise, you know, because it's like a pastiche of a very two-dimensional version of what people in other cultures play.
Yeah, absolutely. And beyond the idea that some, you know, musics get commercially dumbed down. There's the statement, what does world music mean? Is there any music that we've heard that's not from the world? People are talking about third world music or music of cultures that are not European American. You don't turn on the country music channel, and get world music in the United States. So there's kind of this idea that there's this desire to have a dialogue with a periphery, but keeping clear who's the center and who's the periphery. The question that got asked came specifically from when I was talking in that story about playing with Susanna Baca's band. And Susanna Baca is one of the great artists of Black Peruvian music. And her band at the time, early, like around 2000, is one of the best bands that I ever heard in my life. I mean, the basic tracks of those first albums on the Waka Bop that they put out, some of the strongest music I ever heard in my life. And I came in, it's also some of the most difficult, okay? I mean, a lot of people, let's put it this way, a lot of gringos don't know where the one is when they hear Cuban music. It takes you a while to get with the program because the emphasis can be on the 4 in a tumbao rhythm. But with Black Peruvian music, festejo in particular, it's offset in a way that makes it really hard to pick up where the one is. So when I was talking about meaning in music, I was saying simply, I was jamming with this stuff, but I didn't know where the one is. And like, when I figured it out, I was like so embarrassed. Like I called Craig Street, who was the producer, and I did something I'd never done in my life. I said, Craig, man, please erase my tracks. I'll give you back the check. And Craig cracked up and said, well, Susanna likes it. So that was that, like it stayed on the record. And it works in the way it works, but so when I was talking about meaning, I'm saying it was that very basic thing is I wasn't hearing one in the same place. So I don't think listeners have to go for some secret meaning or something, but yeah, I do think those kind of things are the common language among the musicians is important. Are we going into the respond to the chat section yet?
Yeah, I mean, Elliot, do you want to, you've already sort of started moderating, but I'm happy to, kind of jump in. Do you want to, have you had a chance to look at them and want to pull some, or would you like me to?
Yeah, if you want to moderate, that would be great.
Sure.
I'm
Okay.
an immoderate person.
All right.
Nature,
So yeah, let me see what we got here. Let's see. Carrie asks, I have a geeky question. What are your favorite guitars and pedals, and what are your relationships to them like?
I'm very traditionalist in terms of guitars and pedals. Like, I've done a lot of stuff on a Telecaster. Right now I'm playing, I took with me on the road a Gibson L50, or maybe it's an L40, I can't tell, with a, yeah. So I use a wah-wah pedal, and this is terrible because I can't remember I can't remember the manufacturer's name, but it's rainbow colored and it's a great wah-wah pedal. Oh my. King of Tone distortion pedals, try to use good optical volume pedals, a Memory Man, get the 350T, the one with the 350T chip. That one's cool. Memory Man delay. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to bore other people, the non-musician people to death with this. So I'm going to stop there on that question. But where's the guy, or the man or woman who asked the question of favorite absurdist authors? Is that in there? Did I hallucinate?
Yeah,
that?
no, it's there. It's there. Yeah.
Okay, because I'm going to have to talk about Daniel K. Harms. genius, and I wasn't surprised. It sent me back a little bit when I found out that my favorite poet of all times had starved to death in a mental institution during the siege of Stalingrad. But, I hope to do better myself.
So Stefan asks, he thanks both of you for your music production over the years. He particularly enjoyed the fatherhood stories in the book. He would love to hear more stories about Hal Willner from either of you.
Elliot, why don't you lead with that?
Well, I think the first time I worked with Hal was in 1980. I'm trying to remember when he did the first of the Kurt Weill compilations, probably 1986 or so. And he asked me to choose something, and I chose the Meatball song, which was from Weill's Berlin period. And I brought Susan Dahim and Bobby Previtt and Charles K. Noyes into the studio with me, and we were working at the power station, which was great. And Hal was like kind of splitting his time. He was really where he said, "Oh, make it weird, or make it exactly. Oh, I don't know if they're going to like this. I don't. No. Really, just go all out. Make it exactly the weirdest thing you can. Go. No. Don't. They're really going to hate." And it was really kind of a very schizophrenic. So we ended up working for about 6 or 7 hours on this 2-minute song, which was actually very enjoyable to do because it was a very dialectical process, you could say.
Yeah, I think that was.
But Hal,
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and going to Hal's house when he lived in the West 50s, it was the ultimate teenager's room filled with comic books and weird books of poetry and transcriptions of Lord Buckley and hundreds and hundreds of vinyl LPs and video cassettes, up with that wall piled high with video cassettes of Lenny Bruce and whatever, like when he was working on Night Music, when he was the music director of Night Music, the David Sanborn show that we both played on at different times. Mm-hmm. So just hanging out with him, it was the conversation was like being in a pinball machine.
Yeah, a pinball machine with with an encyclopedic knowledge of all the dialogue of the Three Stooges, and Hal was like a huge fan of beat culture, but also of the pop culture that surrounded it. So I talk about how he's very missed, Hal. There was a certain tension with people on the scene who were doing new music, because part of Hal's task and his genius was in managing to get difficult music into network television, major label recordings. So he'd placed himself in between those media and us as a conduit. So there was inevitable tensions. But at the end of the day, like I wrote in the story, he got Sun Ra on network television, and you didn't. You meaning the general you who were pissed at Hal for doing, for making this or that change.
Well, what's funny is that Hal grew up, as we did, at a time when Top 40 radio was filled with weirdness. The weirdness was eliminated. It was always there in American culture, especially during the late 50s and mid 60s, late 60s. But it was eliminated when the corporate control of radio happened. You could hear all kinds of things that we would never hear now. Jimi Hendrix would never be played in Top 40 radio now. That's for sure.
Yeah. Does anybody listen to Top 40? I guess people do.
Or the equivalent on playlists. Playlists now control everything in streaming media.
Yeah.
It's a difference between a royalty of 10 cents or $100,000.
I think Jimi Hendrix, the equivalent of Jimi Hendrix would probably be heard on Spotify. He just wouldn't be paid.
Exactly.
Oh, I see it. Do you mind if I pick one out of the chat?
Please do, yeah.
Similarities in the process of writing music and writing text stories. I don't know how it is, Elliot, with you, but with me, like I get more and more usually frustrated and not know why. And then I wake up really early in the morning or the middle of the night, and if something happens, if I wind up playing guitar, it comes out as music. And if I wind up typing in my computer, it comes out as text. But it's going to be either one or the other, and like getting into one completely destroys it for the other.
Well, it's, for me, it's just you get a creative spark from something, whether it's something good or something bad, or even something neutral. There is this urge to output it. And it's just a question of finding the right frequency. A big revelation for me years ago in college was reading Walter Benjamin's article at The Task of the Translator, where he speaks about finding, it's not about the words. When he was translating Baudelaire into German, it's not about finding the correct words, it's about finding the essence and then putting that out there. So maybe it's taking a walk. You don't have to do anything creative on your own. That creative impulse is fulfilled by taking a walk or cooking something or doing nothing. I mean, I'm finding my better work as a composer, as an author, is done by not trying to do it. I just sit and listen, and wait and drink coffee. Also, that facilitates the process. But still, there's a lot of nothing doing that allows it to happen.
Yeah, right on to that. Right on to doing nothing, expressing ourselves by doing nothing. I'm a big Oblomov fan. I don't know if we have time to keep going.
Yeah, we can take a couple more. Sure. Brett is asking, how does Europe fare insofar as like open-mindedness in the audience? Is there ways that Europe has changed for touring, performing, like experimental and improvisational music?
Well, as I'm sure Elliot would affirm, most, especially East Coast people who are involved with new music, jazz, or avant rock, or cutting edge forms of electronic music, tour a lot in Europe. And as what I said, similar to what I said about Spotify, I mean, we play in New York too, but there is a lot more, people tend to get paid better in Europe for a lot of, well, I could get into a long explanation of why, but yeah, there's a lot more subsidy, there's a lot more awareness of what this group, this scene of musicians in particular is doing. So, I mean, there's a lot of differences between places in Europe, there's also a much wider definition, and probably a wrong definition of jazz in Europe, from which some of us have benefited.
Well, they've always had a much more open sense of what the spectrum of music encompasses. There's a lot of sense of history. I think it's just the way Europe looks at things. Americans want to deny history because you might learn something if you know your history, and change the way you act. Where Europe, I mean, America's never had heavy pitched warfare on its mainland, and Europe has had it for hundreds of years. It's going to change. The lesson doesn't always come through. They try to export it to elsewhere, but still, they have managed to maintain a sense of history and culture. I would say also, audiences in Europe are older and younger. In America, it seems your audiences are mostly your peers. Or, I mean, as we're getting older, our peers are disappearing. But in Europe, it's the old people and the young people. You know, it's great.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, some places in Europe seem to be catching up with America in the clueless department. But
The American
anyways,
business model.
but I mean, I don't know, I don't want to make, it's hard to make general statements. I mean, there's communities in the United States that are just are doing incredible things and supporting incredible scenes. And it's too big a subject to get into in the last, my fellow Americans, there's some truth to that statement. So it's too big a subject to get into in the last 2 minutes of this discussion.
Well, I would like to thank you both for a really amazing talk. Can we hear a little bit about what you're both working on right now and what you're kind of looking forward to in the future?
I'm touring a Ceramic Dog CD that came out. I'm writing solo pieces. I'm trying to write solo pieces mostly because I'm in Italy, and that's what I have is my guitar. I don't know if that counts as working. Elliot?
Yeah, well, I think it's work. It's work, but good work. It's, I turned 70 this year, so I set out the task for myself of putting out or writing a new piece every week. So I've been releasing a lot of things on Bandcamp, collaborations, solo works, digging up archival things, and then getting ready, hopefully, to tour again. I'm supposed to come to Los Angeles in October for the Angel City Jazz Festival to play a duo with Jeff Parker, the guitarist from the band Tortoise, and I'm really looking forward to that. Coming to San Francisco later in October for Other Minds Festival to play solo. And then finally, I wrote a science fiction Beethoven opera where Beethoven, thanks to his various delusions, whether due to his own homegrown craziness or syphilis or whatever comes unstuck in time, visits our reality and goes back to write the Grosse Fuge, which to me is the first contemporary string quartet. And so in this opera, he goes back and forth, and the string quartet, which is playing continuously rewritten versions of the Grosse Fuge, accompanies his internal monologue and his rants and his thoughts. That's supposed to finally premiere in September in Germany after being postponed 4 times thanks to COVID.
Elliot, Mark, thank you so much. Please be well.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. It's a pleasure. Great to see you, Mark.
Likewise. Well, great to hear you, Elliot.
Yes, indeed.
I
don't have control over my camera. I'd rather be the disembodied voice here.
Well, we may not be live, but we ain't dead.
Indeed.
Catch you
Although
later.
it's good for business. It's good for the legend.
Be
See
well.
you soon.